we all have
100%.
these broad tendencies towards certain kinds of behavior and experience.
So, Colin Deyoung, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you're if I get this right, personality psychologist, personality neuroscientist. You're the creator of Cybernetic Big Five Personality Theory, and you're the associate professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota. I hope
that's correct. Yep, I'm in the psychology department here at Minnesota, and I'm also currently the director of our personality, individual differences, and behavioral genetics program.
Oh, amazing. Behavioral genetics is something that absolutely scrambled my brain when I started looking into it. It's a really amazing topic. But yeah, today I suppose I wanted to kind of root our conversation particularly around attention and personality, and bringing in the social media angle a little bit, maybe talk about dopamine. But I suppose to start off with, I discovered the Big Five personality scale very recently through actually your Understand Myself program that you made with Jordan Peterson.
Oh, interesting. Just first to clarify, I have nothing to do with Understand Myself, with that website and the feedback that it provides. Yeah, that's right. But I created the questionnaire that they use. Okay, so I created a questionnaire called the Big Five Aspect Scales. And this was some work that I did mostly as a graduate student and as a postdoc. The goal was basically to create a questionnaire that had an empirically derived substructure for the Big Five. So what that means is, the Big Five are these broad personality trait dimensions, and personality traits are what we call hierarchical. They have a structure where you can talk about broad personality traits, but then you can break them down into narrower traits as well. So if you're talking about extroversion, for example, you can talk about that as a broad personality trait, but then you can also think about components of it like sociability and talkativeness and assertiveness and activity levels. So there are a lot of different narrower traits that you can decompose these broad traits into. And there are different instruments that are available for measuring the traits, not just at the broad level, but also at the narrower level. But most of those, the set of narrower traits that are measured are not based on some kind of empirical finding. They are based usually on just a kind of rational derivation of what are the interesting specific traits of interest within each of the broader traits. Anyway, so one of the projects I was working on was actually trying to identify empirically some of these narrower traits within each of the Big Five. And we found that there were two major subdimensions within each of the Big Five, and then I wanted to create a questionnaire to measure that. And so I did, and that questionnaire is actually in the public domain because it's part of something called the International Personality Item Pool, which was initiated by Lou Goldberg, one of the great personality psychologists.
Wow. Lou Goldberg, he made the Big Five personality scale, didn't he? Or was it?
There is no such thing as the Big Five personality scale, because there are many different Big Five personality scales. He was the person who first called them the Big Five. Right? So the interesting thing about the Big Five is that they're a scientific discovery. Right? They're an empirical finding. If you have a sufficiently large collection of descriptions of personality and you factor analyze them, which basically means you see which ones tend to go together in the same people, you end up with these five dimensions. And they were actually first discovered a couple of times back in the 1940s and 50s even. But at that time, people were working with much smaller sets of items, of questions, just because the computer power was limited to do this kind of analysis. And yet, nonetheless, people had already discovered these basically the same five factors. And then Goldberg was really involved in, as computer power got better, you could start to analyze larger and larger sets of items, questions, and that led to increasing evidence for the importance of these five factors that he named the Big Five. And then he and other people have created various questionnaire measures.
Yeah, and the one I did actually was the one, I mean, the understand myself one with the multiple factors, like where you had like conscientiousness broken into orderliness and industriousness. And I found it just like, I had never, it was a real revolution for me because I'd never thought of personality. I mean, I knew the word personality, but it didn't have any kind of meaning behind it in that sense. And it gave me this kind of a model that I could use for myself and for other people that was really useful in kind of explaining a lot of behavior and traits in myself, and definitely opened up. I wonder, was it as significant when you first encountered the Big Five aspect, or Big Five in general? Was it significant for you, or was it something you were just kind of like, I don't know, did it seem revolutionary?
It's funny because I guess when I first encountered it as an undergraduate taking psychology classes, I wasn't that interested in it. There were other aspects of personality psychology that I found more compelling. But then when I got to grad school and I actually started working with data and doing science, because my undergraduate degree was actually not in psychology, it was in the history of science. So I was more humanities oriented. I was studying sort of history and philosophy of science focused on issues in psychology and psychiatry, but more from, a historical point of view rather than a scientific point of view.
Yep.
And when I started actually working on this stuff scientifically, then as I got more immersed in it, then I really started to see the power of this kind of descriptive system like the Big Five. And I always used to say that, like, by the time I got through a couple of years of grad school, it was sort of like whenever I would talk to people, I would just have like a little bar graph in my head of like the 5 different traits, measuring people's traits. So so it wasn't quite as immediate. It wasn't like this sort of immediate revelation, but it definitely, especially as I got more immersed in it, became something that I found really helpful in terms of understanding other people and myself as well.
Yeah, and I'm kind of upset that it's not more popular, to be honest. I've been like kind of an evangelist for it a little bit in my own life, getting people to do the tests and things like that. I think it can be a hard sell to people maybe because they kind of treat it like a school exam or something. Everybody wants to pass or get 70% or above. And
do you think that's how people do it?
I think, yeah.
Because I see a lot of interest.
Some people that would be, yeah.
There's a lot of interest out there in the public in personality questionnaires, and in various, all kinds of different ones. The ones that aren't particularly scientifically based either, like the Myers-Briggs or the Enneagram or whatever.
Unfortunately, I would say.
Yeah, probably those are more, they have better marketing because they're not constrained by reality. They can say whatever they want about them and it doesn't have to be scientifically supported. So
that's a great point.
It's good for marketing if you don't have to pay attention to what's real.
Yeah.
But
makes it a lot easier.
And I think people genuinely want to know about themselves. I don't think that they necessarily approach these by, trying to get the best score. And obviously if you are not as honest as you can be when you take a personality questionnaire, it's not going to accurately represent you, and then you're not going to learn much about yourself. And I don't think it's hard to feel good about your personality if you know that you distorted it to make it look good. Now, of course, people also, I think, accidentally, or subconsciously distort their personalities, but that's a different issue. That's more like self-deception. I think generally, especially when it's just for, when it's anonymous or when it's just for your own interest, that people generally do approach them trying to give accurate answers rather than just desirable ones.
Yeah, and it's more efficient that way, and doing them over time as well. It's something I've always wanted to revisit to see kind of the changes and measure them kind of against each other. But I suppose, because we could talk about personality all day, I really find it a fascinating subject. Sure. But just to narrow it down, so in terms of attention, I wondered if you could say a little bit on either the function of attention or how it connects to personality. I really wanted to pick your brain on that specifically. If there was anything, and then we can try and tie it in with the social media as well after, if that's okay.
Yeah, well, that'd be fine. Social media isn't really an area of my expertise, but, I have some sort of general thoughts about things. In terms of attention, so first of all, I should say, that's a pretty broad concept, even in psychological science. Yeah. So we should make sure that we both know what we mean by that and what we're trying to describe. When I think about attention, I basically think about the way in which we allocate resources in our information processing to specific phenomena in our perceptual field in order to, get more in-depth information and processing about them. And it's sort of, it's a limited resource. We usually link attention to consciousness. And what we are able to consciously pay attention to is a very small amount of information relative to all of the information that comes in through our senses at any one time. So a metaphor that often gets used is as if you have like a flashlight and you can, shine it on certain things. Imagine there's all this kind of darkness or dimness out there, but wherever you shine the light, then you can really see what's going on there and you can get it in detail as opposed to just kind of dimly. And so attention is like this voluntary capacity to move that spotlight around and to process small parts of the world we perceive in more depth. Is that congruent with the way that you're thinking about attention?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm thinking about in terms of prioritization, and that there's, prioritization of things that are salient to us, so that the attention is kind of narrowing in and focusing, zeroing in on in a complex environment with a lot of, too much information to process. It's how we kind of split it up. And I suppose then, in terms of the social media, which is monetizing attention or capturing attention, you had mentioned that it's a finite resource. There is a limited amount of attention. And so I suppose, one of the big issues with the monetizing of attention is that if that's successful and a company completely monetizes somebody's attention, you don't have any attention to use for other things. And there's this kind of, if it's done successfully, a very important resource is being depleted, basically, is one of the kind of ethical issues with it.
Yes, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. The way in which attention is limited, there are two ways in which attention is limited. One is that there's only so much that you can pay attention to at a time. And actually, these two things are really sort of flip sides of the same coin, because then the other thing I was going to say is that you can generally really only pay attention to one thing at a time, especially in detail. Right? So the more you split your attention and try to pay attention to two things, the less, or three things, or however many, the less well you pay attention to any of them. This is why it's dangerous to do other things while you're driving, for example. You're on your phone, texting or whatever while you're driving. Driving's very practiced, it's very automated, and so we feel like, I can drive with only, one eye on the road. But in fact, we're doing much less of a good job of paying attention if we're splitting our attention. And so it's really just this issue of time. So yes, if we're paying, if you're spending most of your time on social media, then that's time when you're not paying attention to other things. So yes, in that sense, it's this kind of finite resource. And if you can capture people's attention, you can own their time, essentially.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a big movement for the time well spent kind of stuff and making it more, I suppose. But something I suppose I'm trying to get to here basically is the kind of the salience issue. And I mean, there's big aspects of marketing that like the kind of user experience of these things that are designed to be salient to us, like the red notifications and the infinite scroll and that kind of stuff. And something I wanted to touch on with you, which is like the changing of the salience landscape through technology. Is that something that I know you deal with personality change? But like, do you think that this type of technology will, through changing a person's salience landscape over time, change their personality traits? I'd heard you talk about the dopamine before, or the dopaminergic system changes to it over time through characteristics can change personality traits. I wonder, is that something you see with this type of persuasive technology?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So
it's a
first,
big question,
to say a little bit about, I'm not sure. Probably. I'm not sure how common it would be, but like here, let me just describe what I'm talking about here, because it'd be useful just for people who are listening to this to hear a little bit about the way that I think about personality traits. So we all have 100%. These broad tendencies towards certain kinds of behavior and experience anywhere at any time in human history. So I'm sure, like, going back to when there were people just like living in caves, hunter-gatherers, whatever, that some people were more outgoing and talkative and others were less, right? So, extroversion would have been a relevant personality dimension at any time in human history. Some people would, when you're sitting around the fire at night, I'm sure some ancient people like to argue and others didn't, so argumentativeness would have been something that we can use to describe differences between people at any time in history. And so it's those kinds of universal distinctions between people that are what I consider to be personality traits. And those broad tendencies are likely to be influenced by various kinds of underlying neurobiological processes. I mean, everything that we do is neurobiological, right? Because the brain, it doesn't matter whether it's your genes that influence something or whether it's your environment that influence something. They have to change your brain if they're going to change your personality. And so the brain is what's driving your behavior and experience and those patterns in it at any time. And so then we can think about, like, if there are these broad personality traits, what are the underlying biological causes of them? And that's where the neuroscience comes in. And then what are the kinds of factors that might actually shift those biological parameters over time? And that's the kind of thing you're asking about. Like, is it possible that, spending all of your time on social media might actually change some of your brain parameters in such a way that it would have this wide influence on some of your broad personality traits? Now obviously it's changing your habits, and there's one way in which we can say habits are part of people's personality as well, because they're the things that they persistently do. They're like characteristic of them. But when we think about changing personality traits, it's beyond just changing habits, because it's sort of changing these general settings. And so I guess, the question is,
okay, interesting.
If you do something, it doesn't matter what it is in your life, if you do something or if something happens to you that causes you to get more anxious about things or depressive or have less energy, if that persists over a long period of time, then that's part of your personality has changed just by definition, because personality is people's persistent tendencies. So we know that personality changes with mental health problems, and that when people get therapy of all different kinds, in as much as therapy is effective, it tends to affect personality. And in the Big Five, it usually has the largest effect on neuroticism, which just refers to the tendency to experience negative emotions, things like anxiety, depression, sadness, irritability, all of those. And so, we know that people can have their general tendencies, their general levels of neuroticism can improve over time. And so, they can also get worse over time. Now, I don't know, to the best of my knowledge, there isn't good research yet that clearly shows systematic effects of social media use on personality. And I think that's, well, for one thing, there are very few things that have been discovered where we can show that they have systematic effects on people's personality traits. A couple of things that have been pretty well demonstrated at this point are getting your first job and getting into your first romantic relationship. Seems to be pretty clear that those shift these broad personality traits, some of them. But it's very hard to find things that have these kinds of systematic effects on personality, and that's probably partly because there are a lot of things that have an effect on people's personalities, but have different effects for different people. So the effects aren't systematic. So that makes them harder to find scientifically. And social media is probably like that. It's probably the kind of thing that for some people it has a detrimental effect, for other people it has a beneficial effect, for other people it has essentially no effect on their broad personality tendencies. And that makes it that hard to study. It doesn't, but it's worthwhile because it's increasingly such a pervasive part of human experience, at least in developed countries. The technological revolution of the internet, of just having this kind of like infinite supply of information and interaction at your fingertips all the time in your pocket. That's at least as big a technological transformation as like the invention of the printing press. Which had, when things to read became easily accessible and widely distributed, that had a huge effect on human societies. But it's hard to, when these changes are happening, it's hard to see and predict exactly what the changes are going to be. So I think we have no idea what the outcome of the information age is going to be on human functioning. And
I know that's
society.
the absolute nightmare with studying social media as well, because it's such a hyper object and there's so many different strands to it. It's very difficult to isolate, what's going on. There was an interesting distinction you made there between character and personality, because one of the things that comes up in ethics obviously is the effect on character through habits over time. And so like if somebody's habitually distracted, being distracted can become, it's harder for you to pay attention to things. So I wonder how would you define character relative to personality?
Oh, that's funny. I was just about to ask you how you would define character.
Yeah, I was wondering because there was a distinction there. For me, I guess it's a difference between the personality traits or your tendencies, but it's sort of it's not an ethical distinction. I mean, character for me is made up of your judgments and your actions. So I guess personality is a part of that, but I would look at it more as a bit you have the awareness or regulation of in a, I suppose, a moral sense.
I think the way
that ethical sense.
Character is not a concept that I use in my work, but people who use it are often people who are working on moral philosophy or moral psychology. Because just historically, the word character often refer, as you say, it's like things that people have voluntary control over, aspects of their judgments, things that we think reflect on their moral qualities. Right? Do they behave in accordance
virtues
with
and vices?
Virtues, vices, yeah, exactly. So that's often how character is used. For myself, I would think of character then as just kind of, some aspects of character we could describe as personality traits, like honesty. Honesty usually gets lumped in with character because it's so relevant morally. But to me, honesty is just another personality trait. It's just one that happens to be important from a moral perspective. Some people are more honest, some people are less honest, and I'm sure that's been true in every society in human history. But now, the thing that you might be picking up on is this idea of characteristic adaptations that I talk about in some of my theoretical work. And there, so characteristic doesn't mean having to do with character in the sense of when we talk about character as these kinds of moral traits. Their characteristic just means whatever is representative of you. Like if I say, oh, well, it's really characteristic of him that he would, spend a lot of time, playing sports. And that's how I'm using the word characteristic. It just means like what is descriptive of you over time. So it's a way to describe some aspect of personality. But the reason that we distinguish between personality traits and characteristic adaptations is that your adaptations are the way that you've adjusted to the circumstance of your specific life, right? Your specific life circumstances. And so, something like, if I really like to, play basketball, and I've always spent a lot of time playing basketball when I can, let's say, that would be what we would call a characteristic adaptation. So it's part of my personality in the sense that it's something that you could describe me by using that. And it is something that I do persistently. It's relatively stable, it's long-term. But it doesn't really fit the meaning of personality traits as we usually use it. So we wouldn't want to call that a trait, but we want to have some way of describing that as an important component of somebody's personality, but that they've learned a way that they've adapted to their situation. And so that's usually what I'm talking about when I'm talking about characteristic adaptations versus traits. Yep. And another word that works for characteristic adaptations is just habits, basically, right? It's like your habits of thinking, your habits of acting. That are based on this kinds of specific ideas or goals that you have or interpretations of your world rather than the more basic tendencies.
Yeah, that makes, I'm thinking now, I suppose, of personality disorders and the idea of like psychopathology and its relationship to personality, because that's definitely kind of if social media promoted traits of psychopathology, like a lot of people say it increases narcissism. I don't know if there's any evidence for that, or any, actual studies on it. But could you say then that, if there was I'm thinking of it in terms of regulation of social media, of algorithms, in a way that you could define to say this is a bad thing. It's creating this type of characteristic in people, or this type of, you know, adaptation over time. Would that be something that you think would be, viable?
Well, I think it's an important thing to study, right? And so, you know, it might just be that people adapt in certain ways to these things, and that can be, you know, well, that can be disruptive or annoying in and of itself. It's like if you're out with a group of people, let's say, you know, you go to a restaurant with a bunch of friends, and maybe there's a change now than from 20 years ago, where back then you would have just been engaged with those people the whole time, whereas now half the time, half the people are looking at their phones instead. And so that's a very different way to adapt to that kind of situation, and maybe we would decide, like, we don't like that. But then there's also the possibility that you alluded to, that things that are a little bit more basic, like people's personality traits and general tendencies might change. Like if it really does increase narcissism, or if it really does make people, or at least certain people, more depressed. And that, you know, so first of all, as I said earlier, social media is not my area of expertise. It's not something that I do research on. And so, like, I know that there are people doing research on it, and I know that there are people studying, you know, its effects on things like depression and narcissism. I'm not sure exactly where that research stands at the moment. My impression is that there isn't anything that's really solidly demonstrated at this point, but I know that there's a lot of work being done on it. So, you know, it's one of those sort of stay tuned kind of situations, because I'm sure there will continue to be a lot of research being published on it.
Yeah, for sure. And that's ongoing, I suppose. So to change track a little bit from the social media, I suppose, and to continue maybe on the topic of psychopathology, because I think it's something that's really interesting. I've always, ever since I was an undergraduate doing philosophy, and I heard about Thomas Zaz, the myth of mental illness, which actually really annoyed me when I heard about it, because I thought it felt like kind of an affront or something. It felt very offensive, and I got kind of emotional about it. But then once I actually read it and understood the argument, I kind of went, wow, there's a lot more going on here than I'd given it credit for. And I know that's something that in your work you're really kind of expanding on in a way that's fascinating. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that, and like the concept of, you know, mental health and psychopathology.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. And Thomas Saz is very interesting. I think two things are true. First of all, that he doesn't get enough credit for the kind of subtlety and insight of what he was talking about and what he was saying. But second, also, that he went overboard in that direction, in the idea that
he threw the baby out with the bathwater, didn't he?
Yeah, he threw the baby out with the bathwater, you might say, with the idea that mental illness is fundamentally socially constructed and based only on the values of the society that decides who is mentally ill or not. So I definitely would not go to that extent. People's experience and who is judged to be well or not. There's obviously a lot that is socially constructed about that. But I think fundamentally at base, there are ways in which people can experience dysfunction, in which they cease to be able to get the things that they need and want in life. And to deny that is some kind of an illness that might benefit from intervention or treatment seems misguided to me. So it's very interesting, because we're just sort of pulled between these two extremes, right? On the one hand, you have the myth of mental illness, the kind of the Saz approach to things. But then on the other side, you have the current obsession with the idea that if we can only understand what's going wrong in people's brains, then we will know exactly who is and who isn't mentally ill, and we'll know how to treat it. And I don't think that is a useful way to approach it either, because fundamentally what we're talking about with mental illness is not brain disease, it's a behavioral problem. In most cases, there are exceptions, right? So if you look at something like Alzheimer's, for example, I was just talking with one of my friends and colleagues about this a couple of days ago, Roman Kotov, and he was talking about the fact that if you look at the very first report of Alzheimer's, more than 100 years ago. There's a case report, and after death, there's an autopsy, and they see the sort of general reduction in the atrophy of the brain and the plaques and tangles. They're characterizing these very same physiological features and disruptions of the brain that we are still talking about as at the root of Alzheimer's today. So that clearly is something that you can describe as a brain disease, right? The psychological dysfunction follows from a particular pathogenic process. Okay, that's still debatable. We don't know exactly how the sequence of events comes about that produces Alzheimer's in the brain, but we know a lot of the physiological processes that are involved. And so there's an obvious physical pathology there. But you take something like schizophrenia, which was, the basic features of that, whether it was called schizophrenia or dementia precox, those were also described, over 100 years ago at this point. And although we know certain things that are correlated with risk for schizophrenia in terms of brain function, we do not have any clear specific marker or understanding of what goes on in people's brains who are schizophrenic versus who aren't. And in fact, even the category schizophrenia is problematic as well. We could get into that, but that's kind of another issue. But regardless of that issue with diagnosis, like psychosis is a real phenomenon. People have hallucinations, they have delusions, they lose touch with an accurate modeling of reality, and that causes them severe problems and dysfunction, right? And so we need to know what to do about that. And I don't think we want to say merely that is, that we don't consider that a disease or a disorder merely because society doesn't value it, right? So that's why Saz's approach is fundamentally wrong in some way, very limited. But at the same time,
very extreme.
Very extreme, yeah. But at the same time, it's not clear that there is a single neurobiological process or problem that is responsible for schizophrenia. It makes more sense probably to think about it in terms of what is the kind of information processing that the brain has to do, what are the kinds of models and control processes that it enacts, and how do those functions go wrong? Now, some of those functions may be more likely to go wrong if you have certain types of brain characteristics. And so we can think of these biological features as risk factors. But that's not the same as saying that the disease itself is just a disorder of the brain in the way that Alzheimer's is. So I think there's always going to be a place for this psychological description of psychological medicine. It's like, yes, obviously the brain is what carries out psychological functions, but you can have a brain that is reasonably healthy in terms of it's within the range of the normal range of human variation, but it's still functioning badly and going wrong in various ways that might be related to mood disorders, depression, or psychotic disorders like schizophrenia or ADHD or whatever else. They're not exactly brain diseases in the way that is currently popular to think about them.
Yeah, and I saw if I understand correctly, with the some of the with your work that you've done on well-being, that there's a connection there between the mental illness or the experience of mental illness and your goals not being met. You're not being properly ordered or being met, that your kind of model of reality is outdated, and so you're experiencing this kind of, I know a lot of people that go into therapy experience feeling stuck or feeling like they're kind of, they can't get to the next bit, and you're kind of then undergo a period of education and a reinvention to get to the next level, and that medicalizing that process might actually be a mistake when it's actually something else.
Yes, well, medicalizing in the sense of treating it as a purely physiological problem. I mean, we can talk about behavioral medicine, right? You can argue that going to a therapist and talking about your problems and talking about strategies to address them and things like cognitive behavioral therapy
is medicine,
or acceptance and commitment therapy. All these different. I don't see any reason to say that that's not medicine. I think that is medicine, but I think what you're talking about is like the tendency to say any complaint that you have, we'll throw some pills at it. Right? It's like if we can only just get the right combination of neurotransmitters, if we can just get the right drugs into you, then all your problems will be solved. And that's clearly not
It'll be fine.
Not the case. That's clearly not how it works. I mean, which is not to say that pharmaceuticals don't help some people, because they do, but it's very unpredictable whom they're going to help. Like, we do not have, a psychiatrist might like to give the impression that we sort of have this list, and it's like, if you have this problem, we give you this drug. But in fact, it's more like, for this long list of problems, we also have this long list of drugs, and we can kind of sort of randomly match them up and see what helps. And for some people, some of them help, and for some people, others help, and for some of the people, none of the ones that we have help. And that is really indicative of the fact that, at some level, that we don't know what we're doing biologically. And I say that, like, I study the neurobiology of personality and mental disorders. That's the main focus of my research. And because of that, I know how limited our current knowledge is of those things so far in terms of, the brain basis of them. And so,
that's kind of, sorry. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to get back to because you asked this question about goals, and I think that is really important because fundamentally all organisms are goal-directed systems. The word cybernetic refers to that idea that some systems are organized in such a way that they pursue goals based on feedback. They get feedback and they can adjust their behavior based on that feedback in order to pursue various goals. And so those goals would not only be, for people, are not only kind of concrete things like, I don't know, I want to get a promotion at work or something, but they're also these things that are more like fundamental basic needs, like I want to have a connection to other people and good relationships, or I want to, feel good about myself, and I don't want to spend a lot of time feeling negative emotions. Those are goals too, right? And I think that a very strong case can be made that all mental illness is fundamentally defined by people having an inability to pursue their goals effectively. And that can be partly because they have a model of the world that's wrong in some way or inaccurate in some way. But it can also be because they have an inappropriate set of goals. Right? They may have a collection of goals, values, needs, whatever you want to call them, that don't fit well together with each other, that have various conflicts in them, so they simply cannot all be, met at once. And so I think, the job of mental health practitioners is fundamentally to try to get people to a place where they have a working set of interpretations of themselves in the world that and skills and strategies that allow them to pursue a reasonably well integrated and effective set of goals. And sometimes giving somebody a pill is going to put their brain into a different state that allows them to achieve that kind of self-regulation and balance. But it's probably not the only thing they need, because there's always this additional question of what should I do? Like, how should I act in the world? What should I think about things? That is not purely a drug-dependent question.
Yeah, physiological. Yeah. That was Zaz's point, I suppose, was that he described them as problems in living.
Yes, which is a good description.
That it was always, Yeah, and that there's a lot of, I suppose for a lot of young people, a lot of the reason I'm interested in social media as well is because of the associated mental health problems that it is said to cause. And, there's a lot of evidence about young women and self-harm and the massive issues there that are kind of being perpetrated by what's called an antisocial algorithm, or an algorithm that promotes this type of behavior. But that might be a bit off the subject. But with goals, so then if a person's experiencing this kind of distress or negative emotion, would you advise them to, it depends on the context, but should they be looking for a goal or for the conflict in their goals? Would that be a kind of a starting point if somebody's looking to kind of make sense of that?
Yeah, it's certainly a wise thing to take stock of, like, what is it that you want? What are the things that you value? And, to recognize that sometimes the solution is to figure out a better strategy to get the things that you already value, but sometimes it's to rethink what you're valuing, and maybe to change your values instead.
Ooh. To let go of something or to pursue something else.
Let go of something to pursue something else. Yeah. To change your standards for what success means in a particular domain, for example. It's like maybe you have a particular set of values about how you want your career to go, but you also have a particular set of values about what you want your family life to be like, right? And for many people, those things are difficult to reconcile. And
mutually exclusive.
They're both demanding on your time and your resources, right? And so, one thing that you might do is say, well, I'm not going to I don't necessarily need to completely give up my career or change it entirely, but maybe I just have a different set of standards for what counts as success there. Maybe it's not about being like earning the maximum amount of money possible or achieving the maximum amount of success or fame or whatever it is the thing that you're pursuing in your particular career. Maybe it's about figuring out how you can adjust your values so that even without radical change, you sort of might change the standards for what you think of as success.
And there's a fascinating through line there, which it just reminded me of. I mean, you'd mentioned CBT, and the basis of CBT comes from Stoicism. I actually had Donald Robertson. I don't know if you know him. He's a CBT professor, but he writes about Stoicism a lot. Really great guy, man. Fascinating thought. But his argument was exactly that, really, that why Stoicism was getting so popular was because it changed people's values. It gave them, he described it that it was sticky. Because like CBT would give people techniques, but Stoicism had this kind of worldview. It told you what was valuable, what wasn't valuable. Like don't prize things that are outside of your control, like status, health, reputation. These kind of things are, outside of your sphere of influence. So you'll distress yourself, basically, if you're trying to hold on to them. I'd never heard you talk about Stoicism before. I don't know if it's something that you're interested in or if you had any thoughts on it.
I have a general interest in philosophy, but for whatever reason, Stoicism is not something that I've read much about. So I don't know much about it. But what you were saying there actually reminded me of some of the points that are made by acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT or ACT. I don't know if you've encountered that. Because
I've heard
they make this point that they have a very similar criticism of CBT, which is that it's essentially directed at these very specific strategies so first of all, it's just not necessarily addressing these larger issues of what people value. And second of all, it is kind of focused on this model of the mind as if it was sort of like you receive information and then you process it, as opposed to noticing like what are the points where you can actually intervene, right? It's not just all going on inside your head. And so it can be, it's like, it's fine to say somebody like, well, don't catastrophize, right? This is a common thing. It's like when something bad happens, don't immediately assume that, that this means everything is ruined and that it's going to spiral out of control, right? Because that's a common pattern for people who suffer from anxiety. And so then you think, well, okay, that's great advice, but how? How do you do that? How do you not catastrophize, right? And that's where, there are various ways in which CBT has strategies, but the point that ACT makes is that there are more active ways in which you can help people to engage with their environment that then allow them to make those kind of changes more effectively. And this is, it's tied into the whole movement toward paying attention to mindfulness in contemporary psychological thinking. So the idea of acceptance and commitment therapy is this idea that you need to basically be able to pay attention to the way in which you are evaluating things in your ongoing experience, and basically like figure out what your larger values are and commit yourself to them. And I also, first of all, I should say I'm doing a very kind of like shallow and simplistic job of explaining this. So if people are interested, I recommend going out and reading about it rather than taking my
I
say-so
found it
on
super interesting, to be honest.
But just the basic idea being that if you give people these kinds of tools on what to pay attention to and how to pay attention, then that will enable them to make these kinds of more specific shifts that if you just tell them to make the shift, like don't catastrophize, they don't necessarily have the tools to implement that effectively.
There's a skill, and it's kind of coming back to attention, which is really interesting to a previous kind of loop, which is that there's a skill there in what you should pay attention to, because there's always something I noticed studying the ethics of attention with a guy called Sebastian Watzel. He kind of puts the ethics of attention down to the regulation of salience. Like a person that finds something really aggressive, really salient, would reflect poorly on their character. If they really, enjoyed cruel things or something like that, that would be poor for them. But that there's this quality to attention of where you should put it and where not to put it. So and that's somehow fundamental to healthy functioning as well, it seems, or to your well-being. Like with Stoicism, they'd say don't pay attention to the things, or don't prize the things, maybe don't value so much the things that are outside of your control, because they might, things will happen to them and you don't own that and you're not going to be able to deal with it. So this management of attention and being able to kind of fulfill your values is interesting. I don't know where I was going with that, but it's kind of a tangent.
I mean, I think, but again, you get to the question of how do you train people how to direct their attention, right? Again, it's sort of like the problem with don't catastrophize. It's like, well, don't pay attention to that. Well, how do you do that? I mean, sometime, a couple of years ago, I installed web blocking software on my computer so that I could create a list of, websites that I can not visit for I can set it to 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours, whatever. And that's because,
Nice.
It's annoying that the tool that I use for all of my work is also where all of the distractions are, right? So it's very hard to get away from that. And coming back to this idea of monetizing attention and the all these clever algorithms that are designed to hook people, it's like, how do you fight back against that, right? And so, there are these there are external tools like software that just doesn't let you go to all of the stupid websites that you're going to waste time on. But then there are these kinds of strategies like mindfulness, right, where you engage in practices that actually improve your ability to control your attention. Not just saying don't pay attention to that, but here's a practice to engage in that will help you control your attention in whatever way you want. And then when you encounter the idea don't pay attention to that, then you might actually have some of the skills necessary to follow through on that.
And that you can't tell people what to pay attention to, but you can tell them that it's important for them to pay attention to what they pay attention to, in a sense. Yeah. I remember John Vervaeke, making an argument that's you can't tell people what's virtuous, but you can tell them that it's important to pay attention to virtue for the process by which they try and figure that out.
Right. Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it, right? And it gets at this idea that what you're trying to do is give people the skills to adapt themselves, and that if they know what will make their own lives go better and what will make them more effective, then that is likely to motivate them toward better values and better situations.
Yeah, and that's such a kind of essential skill. It kind of reminds me, there was something I was meaning to ask you about, which is conscientiousness, which is something I think I had wondered with the distraction technology, I suppose, because a big part of conscientiousness is suppressing distractions. I don't know if that's correct, but that's kind of the way I'd interpret it.
Yeah, that is
that's a huge part of it. So with tons of distracting technologies, does it offer some sort of threat to conscientiousness? Like Andrew Huberman had said in one of his podcasts I was listening to, he said that the mark of a mature or of an adult is being able to control your behavior from his kind of biological point of view. A mature organism controls its behavior, and we have technologies that specifically overcome our ability to control our behavior. And so I wonder, is there a threat to conscientiousness? Could improving, your conscientiousness, could that protect you against these type of things a bit more?
Yes. Yeah, I agree with I agree with everything that you just said. Variation in conscientiousness is certainly going to have a lot to do with whether you are able to, to fend off distractions and whether you're able to regulate your own behavior effectively, especially in relation to, longer term goals or more abstract goals. Anything that makes it harder to control your attention or to avoid distractions is a threat to conscientiousness. Every person has their own level of conscientiousness that's kind of going to, set the threshold for where they're overwhelmed, for where they can no longer resist these mechanisms of external control. And so either figuring out ways to improve conscientiousness or reducing these kind of external threats to it are likely to be beneficial to people. And increasingly in personality psychology, there's this movement toward trying to develop protocols that facilitate personality change. In other words, for a long time we thought about these kinds of interventions only in the case of really clinically severe problems. But with the recognition that, first of all, most clinical problems are on a continuum with normal personality variation. They're just sort of more extreme and maladaptive versions. And also just the fact that most people have at least one personality trait that they want to change. That's one of the findings from the last 20 years of personality research.
Yep.
There's this recognition that, well, maybe we can actually develop interventions that will allow people to begin to change their personality traits in a more sort of voluntary and directed manner. And of course, conscientiousness is one of the things that many people would like to increase in themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so, amazing. That was something I'd really thought about with, in terms of social media algorithms affecting people's behavior and stuff, but how you could use that properly to affect personality change, like curating content for people if they wanted to be more, conscientious. Could you have an algorithm that curates content for them that will help them improve that? And it might not be that simple, but is there any programs that that do increase conscientiousness or that have been proven to actually increase it, or is it still vague at the moment?
Well, I think we're in pretty early days of the development of these intervention protocols for personality change. Mm-hmm. So, for myself, I struggled with relatively low conscientiousness when I was younger, and when I was a grad student, I sort of realized I had to figure out how to work more effectively because I was, going into this career. My aspirations, anyway, were to be in a career that's very self-directed, right? It's self-motivated, and so for me, part of it was just about figuring out various ways that I wasted time. I remember one period of time in grad school, I was so frustrated with how much time I seemed to waste that I started keeping a diary in 15-minute increments of every day. What am I doing? Because I was trying to figure out where is all this time going that I'm wasting, And so partly it's that kind of, again, which I guess is one way of thinking about controlling attention, right? It's not what you pay attention to, but learning skills of how to pay attention and what things to pay attention to. And then, it was not just that, it was also just thinking about what really were my priorities, what were my values. When I was younger, I sort of thought of you want to have a career because you need to make you need to earn a living, and it should be interesting because of course you want to do something interesting. But other than that, it's just a way to give yourself the resources to then do what you really want to do, which is just have a good time or hang out with friends or relax or fool around or whatever it is that you're doing that's sort of more frivolous or hedonistic or whatever. And at some point I realized that's not sustainable in terms of this career because it requires so much sort of concentrated and self-directed effort. That's the thing. So you work at a job where somebody else is telling you exactly what to do. Then it's relatively easy to do it. You say, well, I got to do this by tomorrow. But if you have a job where there's no clear deadlines, and there's no one telling you exactly what to do. You have to figure all that out for yourself. I mean, I like it much better. I enjoy being self-directed, but it was also very difficult for me. And I've known people, I had friends in grad school who it was, even though they were very smart, very capable, that aspect of it was too much for them. And they went into, jobs in industry, jobs in other areas that were not academic for precisely that reason. It's like, because I just want to have a 9-to-5 job and be able to forget about it when I go home and have a clear sense of what I'm doing. And that's great. Like, maybe it's about like finding the kind of environment that actually works for you. But, for me, it was just like I had to change my goals around. So it wasn't just like, well, I want to be successful here so that I can have a good time. It's like, no, my primary goal is going to be being a good psychologist, and being a good scientist. And so that gives you the sense the way that if you can change your values effectively and change your sort of basic sense of self and identity, that can then kind of flow downward to organize your more specific behaviors. So, it's sort of
like one of those letting go moments as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, there's you can have change at every level of the goal hierarchy, right? You can have change at these very high levels about like your broad values and broad aims. You can have change at lower levels, like about how you allocate your attention and, what you kind of, strategies for avoiding distraction. Mm-hmm. But then it can be this very concrete, like I mentioned, web blocking software, right? Why not adopt technological solutions that help you to do things that you have difficulty with doing without help?
Mm. Yeah, and I wonder, I guess it might just be that simple in terms of that if you value the conscientiousness enough or the discipline enough that you'll start to act it out, and that in itself can be the catalyst or the transformation. It's certainly a fascinating topic. I feel like the 21st century is going to be the age of self-control because we just have so much more opportunity
it better be.
Yeah, distracting ourselves. Yeah, I hope it is. But it could go the other way. But thank you very much, Colin. That was really, fascinating. And we managed to somehow get all the way around what was a very cumbersome topic. So I really appreciate the way you handled it and just the great answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah, it's nice to talk to you.